Hi, welcome to What's in the Box with Parris Rigby. Today we are going to be talking about the first two main suspects in this situation. I want you to know that this is not a place that I ever wanted to go to or be at, but I feel at this point I have no choice to expose the people that were involved and are still involved in the demise of my life for over a decade. Suspect number one goes by many alias names. The alias names I've never seen so many in my life. In fact, just recently, I noticed that she's blocked on my Facebook, and she changed her last name to one of her alias names. Her name that she typically goes by is Cheryl Rios, R-I-O-S. In 2012 or 13, I can't remember the exact year, she approached me out of nowhere and wanted to sponsor our Halloween party. As many of you know, that we did an annual Halloween party that raised lots of money for, if the money wasn't stolen, or then we raised money for people, either individuals or groups that were in need. At that time, I said to her, there's nothing to sponsor because we'd been doing that and it just grew, the charity event grew on its own. It wasn't something that was, I had a vision of like, 1,000 people attending yearly or anything like that. It was just something that out of the kindness of my heart and the hearts of every host and hostess that was with us throughout the years and for the duration of the 10 years we did them, everybody just wanted to do the best and raise money. At that point, Cheryl was very persistent with me. I got an uneasy feeling, but I wasn't sure exactly what, I wasn't sure. I never had somebody be so persistent. She wanted to write me a check for $1,000. And I said to her that I can't, I'm not going to take a check for $1,000 because there's nothing to sponsor. So she was on and on about it. And she emailed me out of the blue, which wasn't abnormal because people would email me out of the blue because I was doing a lot of charity events and restaurant openings and things like that. And I made my email at that time, which my email at that time was Parris, P-A-R-R-I-S, at thetoprung.org. At that time, my email was out there. I didn't think anything about it. But as time went on, which about a duration of a week, she was more persistent about wanting to be involved in my life. I was very, very naive. At that time, I literally had just taught myself how to write computer languages. Because I had a staffing company at the time. It really hadn't taken off that well, but it was, it is what it is. So I taught myself how to write computer languages so that I could actually communicate with the web developer and the web designer for my very first website that I ever had. I don't know if that was the dumbest decision I made or what, but at that point, I had spent 2 years teaching myself code. Then Cheryl approaches me and she was very persistent about being involved in my life. And I being, Pollyanna, naive, I should have done a background check. I should have realized all the other aliases that she goes under. I should have also realized that she's been involved in so many different companies, which that's not necessarily unheard of. The United States of America allows for people to be entrepreneurs. And sometimes a business doesn't always work out the way that we aspire or we want it to. However, if I would have done a background check at that time, I would have realized that she was very tied in with Jail Call Services, JPay, Secure Us Technology, a whole list of companies that she had, which have grown over the years. I would have probably also realized that she was a recruiter of family members to do part of her demise. And you will learn about that later as we go. But basically, she came to me and wanted that $1,000 check. And I called the owner of the restaurant, because we were doing that Halloween party at Sambuca that year, Holly Forsythe. And I said, Holly, this lady wants to write me a $1,000 check. I don't know what to do. I'm not going to accept it because I certainly wasn't going to put a $1,000 check in my account or a business account because there was nothing to sponsor. So as I previously stated on a previous podcast, Holly came up with a bright idea of saying, hey, let's put this in. Why don't you have her write the check to Sambuca and then we'll do appetizers in place. So that was Cheryl's kind of way, I guess, or I assume her way of getting in my life, building, making me think that she was solid. Also, she presents herself as being a very religious individual. She was working for the Dallas Can Academy at the time. I have a lot of respect for the Dallas Can Academy, being a former educator, still being a licensed teacher in Texas. Therefore, that gave her credibility. However, I didn't know the extent of what she was doing on the web with the different domains, the different websites. And I had no idea that the day that she walked in to start raising money for the Dallas Can, that it became a big debacle with an individual who's a sports broadcaster, a former sports broadcaster in Dallas, and his son, which soon became a pattern in my life. However, at that time, I didn't do my due diligence like I should have. And here we are, 12 years later, and I'm still dealing with the aftermath. Cheryl Reyes, I've never met anybody that I feel like could pull more, I gotta be careful with my words, cons out of a hat. I have a binder, a very thick binder full of the things that she's done. However, I had to narrow it down for this podcast. Therefore, and so at that time, I was writing websites, or I was starting to gain clients. I think I had like maybe 5 clients at the time, but that was still a lot for me because I was still trying to do staffing. I would go to meet with my clients, and I would literally say to, like, maybe it was Primo's. That was a client of mine, the restaurant off McKinney Avenue, the original one. And I was writing the website, and there were like 8 pages that I had done on the website because I never used a template. I wrote it from blank piece of paper with HTML and CSS style sheets. I go and I meet with Frank, the owner at the time, and he sits there, and I could only open up a couple of pages. And I'm like, wait, where is all this? And that was kind of the beginning of the snowball effect of the demise and the sabotage and the betrayal that I ended up going through and still live today. At that time, I was never able to finish any of those websites with those original clients due to the explosion of what happened after that. At that time, I was just trying to gather and just figure out what was going on. But Cheryl and I formed a business together because she claimed to be doing social media. I did events just strictly for charity. She worked for the Dallas Can, that is true. But she claimed that she was very much into their marketing, and I believe she was. I don't know. I met with one of the owners when I started to realize that funds are missing and that their domains, the one they advertised for, or the one they're supposed to advertise for, was not the ones that she had built and things were being donated to. Therefore, in 2013, we started a company called Adding To. We decided to do DBAs underneath. DBAs meaning like event planning, social media, website design, yada, yada. It all sounded like a great idea because at that time, I was staying up sometimes all night long, working and writing code, and because I didn't, like I said earlier, I didn't use a template. And so she had a lot of people that she knew. She knew somebody, which we will introduce that suspect in a little bit, that actually was from India, and he actually wrote websites. And that's where she would send all of her stuff. And she was like, Parris, why are you staying up all night long? You don't need to do that, when you can just send it to him. So I should have known the first website that I said, okay, I'm working with so-and-so. Maybe I was going to test out her guy in India. I immediately got a bill for some crazy amount. And I thought, I haven't even started. I haven't even sent like any of the documents. They don't know anything about this. But I just kind of went ahead and went with it. At that time, in the early 2013, when we first started our business, all of a sudden my emails my emails started messing up. Clients weren't getting stuff. I was showing up at meetings they had canceled. My mail fraud started about 2012, where I wasn't getting my mail, my United States Postal Service mail. Everything at that time started slowly like blowing up. I had lived in the same place for at that point, maybe 5 years, never had a problem, never anything. But at that time, when we formed that business, there was also what I now learn from a PI we hired in 2014 were home invasions and bump keys. And my life was just exploding in the worst possible way that it possibly ever could. In 2013, as I stated, we started that business. That business did not last long. I was the one that brought every client to the table because our agreement was that she was going to close what I thought was only one business that she had, CR Creative Group. And then I was going to close my staffing company, and any event that I did, from Halloween to any charity event, we were going to do together. And then we were going to have the right other hosts and hostesses, and I introduced her to who you will learn who suspect number 2 is, and everybody else. Therefore, that was my fault. I should have done due diligence. I should have realized that what she was telling me was not parallel with what the state of Texas had her registered under. The most painful lesson I'll ever learn. However, as I stated, I brought all the clients to the table. And she never shut her business down. At that time also, she became, for a short period of time, a good friend. You know, I'm a very open person. Like, I just, you know, you're working with somebody, they become your friend. I would notice that things were off. And when I say off, for example, somebody had asked me to go to dinner one night, and I thought, oh, you know, why not ask her, you know, Cheryl if she knows this person? Because I just wasn't, you know, this is pre-stalking days, but I wasn't going to just go to dinner with somebody that I had never heard of. Regardless, she sent me an email back that she sent under an alias email with her signature. And I don't think she realized that she did this. You will see that later on in the podcast. However, that particular email that she sent me back was it was actually a very famous actress's cousin here in Dallas. The cousin lives in Dallas, the actress lives in California. And I'll explain how that all kind of went together, but it really freaked him out because what she came back with me was information about him that supposedly, and I do trust him, and I believe him, even though I haven't talked to him since in years, that the only 30 people in the United States knew about. So it did raise an eyebrow to me, like, why is she sending me an email under an alias email? Why not send it under your email? I mean, who has time to set up alias emails and all that stuff? But I didn't realize the life that she was hiding behind the front that she presented. Therefore, I just kind of ignored that red flag. Dumb, naive, stupid me. And we kept moving forward. And I realized quickly that I was the only one bringing the business to the table. She never brought one client to the table, but she was still doing business under her CR Creative Group and doing business under and bringing clients for her because she gave a persona and actually told people that she worked in marketing. I mean, not marketing, but that she was part of media and this and that. And I mean, I don't know what credentials that requires. I just took her word for it. I never felt like I needed to do a background check to see somebody's degree to determine if they were telling me the truth or not. Because to me, that means that I don't need them in my life. But I learned a hard lesson. Regardless, I noticed, as I stated earlier, my life started blowing up. Things were getting weird. My emails weren't getting to people. I've always been a very reliable person. I was always a very follow-through person. I was a very go-getter person. As Chris Jones will tell you, I'll never forget at one of the Halloween parties. He said to me one day, he goes, Parris, he goes, nothing was getting done until you showed up, and then everything got done in about 10 minutes. Because I was one of those people that just got things done. I was running that charity events. I was running, business. I was trying to build a business. I mean, I spent a lot of time with my family at that time. So I had a very balanced, happy life. But it became quickly chaotic, as I've stated. Wasn't getting mail, and as I've stated in earlier podcasts, and I can't say that Cheryl Reyes had anything to do with the Frost Bank a theft or, I guess, money laundering or whatever you want to call it, and the other bank accounts. But I can say that PayPal, she was directly tied to. We'll get to that. However, that's how I know Cheryl Reyes. Biggest mistake of my life. So as I stated, I brought all the business to the table for all of our web design, social media, because people thought that I did social media because I had 4 Facebook pages, dummy me, I will never do that again, and I had a big web presence. But it wasn't like I went out and that was my goal. It just kind of happened. It just kind of over time, like the Halloween parties, and it just happened, it grew. So to me, I didn't pay attention to it because it didn't mean anything to me until I started having all of this fraud, all of this weird stuff going through the back ends of my Facebook pages, and I was finding bank accounts that were overseas, that were using my actual friends' names, and they were switching the identities to alias names. And again, we'll get back to that email that she sent me. That particular email that she sent me that one time, I had no idea that one individual could even comprehend. It was probably as many aliases as the Webster's Dictionary. Therefore, during that time, she was not only sending emails out that were bogus, but she was also, at that time, doing stuff with our events because I kept a consistency and had since 2005 of doing charity events and my birthday parties, my friends' birthday parties, and things like that. So by the time I met Cheryl, I was really well seasoned into what I was doing. However, I noticed that I'd never had a problem with PayPal, ever. And the first couple of years we did events, we didn't even charge. Robert Colombo actually put the bill down and paid for it and we would bring people to his restaurant. However, again, that was another thing that happened the moment that I met her. PayPal blew up. PayPal and I do not get along to this day. I'm allergic to PayPal. I think I need a Benadryl or an EpiPen to even think about PayPal at this moment. There were all of these, I started getting all these chargebacks through my PayPal when Cheryl got involved. Chargebacks, people saying that they wanted their money back. And also what I thought was very weird was there were charges. We would charge per ticket, sometimes $20. And then depending on what I now know is called event ticket sales sabotage. But towards the later years, we would charge sometimes $25 because people weren't buying the tickets as soon as they typically would. That's a whole different story for you, which I'll get to. But I will just briefly say that with PayPal, one thing that I recognized, but I didn't process it at the time because my world was blowing up, that we would charge sometimes $20 and then $25, which we started doing that later on because the ticket sales weren't happening. And I now know why the ticket sales weren't happening because Cheryl Reyes decided to set up Constant Contacts and Eventbrite and run things through those entities as if it was what I had built, because I was always the one that built the websites. I did everything, and then we reused one source. So at that time, I noticed that sometimes people would buy a ticket and it would be $20. Sometimes it'd be $22 and something cents. Sometimes if they bought 2 tickets, it'd be $44. And I thought, this is so bizarre. But again, my world was blowing up and I was coming home to weird stuff. Like my feet are baby feet and big shoe prints on my ground. I was coming home to, my animals being just freaked out, which you'll learn about that in later podcasts about all the home invasions and such. So I was just trying to, my mind doesn't go to, and it didn't even at that time go to like worst case scenario. I mean, now through the trauma that I've lived from Cheryl Reyes and suspect number 2 and the rest of them, there have been times where trauma just will get you. However, at that time, I was not that person that overreacted or that person that went to the worst case scenario. So I was that go-getter, get things done. But at that time, Cheryl immediately, the first event she attended when she wrote that $1,000 check, then after that, I had her involved. I mean, because it just made sense. She was a business partner. It just made sense. That business didn't even last like 6 months. Because a very good, dear friend of mine, because sometimes you don't know. You don't know how somebody knows somebody that they're doing business with. It could be a good friend. It could be a loyal friend. It could be a betrayal. Who knows? But Cheryl, unsolicited, went behind my back to solicit business from somebody named Scott. And I won't use his last name for security reasons. However, she immediately set up a time with him to meet with him about the website that I was building. And I had started building prior to even knowing Cheryl. But again, my world was blowing up. So the go-getter, get things done Parris Rigby, as Chris Jones would say, is not the Parris Rigby that I was slowly melting and drowning without realizing what was happening. Cheryl made an appointment with Scott. And she did this on email. And Scott immediately replied back and said, well, is Parris involved in this? Is she going to attend? Something to that nature. You'll see the email. So, when you're running this many criminal situations, you clearly do things as send emails out under your name that aren't yours, bogus this, bogus that, and then you forward the entire thread of that email to the person that you were trying to steal business from, which would be me, Parris Rigby. She told him that the time that they had wanted to meet on a Thursday, that I was not available. When I reviewed that, even way back then, pre-arsenic, pre-everything else that happened, I thought to myself, interesting. How did Cheryl know that I was not available on Thursday to meet with somebody that is not only a friend of mine, but also, somebody that I was building a website for? I thought, how did she know that? But I'm not the person that's going to walk up to you and confront you. I'm going to sit back and watch. And I'm going to see what you're going to do. Oh, I've had a front row seat and I've gone through a lot of popcorn. That's for sure. Therefore, she's forwarded me, I think, her conscious. Maybe that conscious, that kicks in with most of us, carry it with us all the time, but kicked in every once in a while, She sent me the thread of the email and wanted to know when I could meet with she and Scott. That was the beginning of the demise, the business. Then as the 6 months goes on, I am working my rear off because I am a hard worker. I think that's the only reason that I've survived the last 12 years. And the reason there's a mound of evidence is because I'm an overachiever. And it kept my sanity during this insane time with somebody that clearly, I don't even know how many people that she's done wrong, but I've heard about them. However, at that time, Cheryl was with me, and we didn't even meet with Scott. We ended up doing a presentation for Scott and his business. However, Cheryl was just adamant about building the presentation, and I was like, sure, I didn't do PowerPoint. I mean, not that I couldn't figure it out, but I was trying to write websites from scratch. I was writing really good, nice websites for people, and I was doing what I said I was going to do because that's who I am. But then I was also having to redo and do again. And then I was starting to lose my integrity and my credibility because I was showing up at meetings or I was missing meetings that was never something that I had ever done. And I am from Dallas, Texas, so thank God that I have had an integrity and reputation prior to, or otherwise I'd have been slaughtered, completely slaughtered, and no comeback, no Phoenix Rising, nothing. However, at that time, she did the presentation. I was cool with that, didn't matter to me. But I didn't realize that she was trying to solicit business and she was still running her business under CR Creative Group. She never shut that down as we agreed. Cheryl, and I'm going to say this on camera because I can prove it. She's a master manipulator. And in being a master manipulator, if you know what that term means, Google it, go to Webster's Dictionary. That means that you do things with an intent. You have an intent to sabotage somebody. You have an intent to cause harm to somebody. And the other person is unaware, naive, unless they got walls up a mile around them. So I was unaware of what she was doing. I was unaware of the fact that she was running stuff through. She set up her own PayPal, through Adding To, which was our business. I knew nothing about that. She also set up email addresses. There's mystery email addresses that, it's incredible, under Adding To. And just in 2018 or 19, which that business has not even been touched at that point in 5 or 6 years, her niece was all of a sudden one of the people that was involved in the business. I have that. She was recruiting her family members, as I stated earlier, to do part of her demise. It's a really sad situation. And as you'll learn as this podcast goes on, and you realize all the phone numbers that were spoofed, all the phone numbers that were coming through my stuff, you'll realize that I believe, and I'm with wholeheartedly, and I will show you evidence, that she was part of her working at Dallas Can. I think she was recruiting people to do some of her criminal activity. I do not have exact proof of that because I do not know exactly who went to the Dallas Can. So I'm stating up front that is of my belief. It is not a factual thing, but when I started looking at phone numbers, and I started doing, the phone numbers, I've got a binder about that thick full of phone numbers, actually 2, full of all the phone numbers that were coming through my stuff. The back end of Facebook, my phone, everything. And at one time, I learned how to search all that, and there was this long chain of kids that were doing stuff. And as you will learn who suspect number 2 is, she told me early on that Cheryl Reyes hired somebody to mess with me, and that person became obsessed with me, and that person couldn't let go of my demise. However, me fighting for my life, me fighting to keep my reputation, integrity, and do what I say I'm going to do because I've always been that person, I was drowning. Cheryl was rising. She was working at the Dallas Can. She was very close with Richard Marquez, who was the president. I'm not sure if he still is. But there was a relationship there. And I can't say anything. I'm not going to say anything that was anything because I don't know. The man, I don't know the man. I've never met him. But again, when I learned that there was the DallasCanAcademy.com or whatever, the .com, which I have, that she was building other websites or doing what's called it's called forward with masking, meaning that if you went to parrisrigby.com, that unless you have eagle eyes like me and you've been betrayed to the level that I have, technology, you wouldn't realize the domain changed. It switched. It's called forward with masking. And sometimes she would do that. And so there would be people making donations to a .org, a .uk, a .something else. And it wasn't actually the domain that they actually typed in the system, and or there was a completely different website set up. I obviously have no idea what was going through those other websites that people thought was the Dallas Khan Academy. But at the time, back in 2013, when my world started blowing up and I started going, whoa, what's going on? I met with Ira Terrell, the basketball player. He was very good friends with Malcolm Wentworth. Malcolm Wentworth evidently was on the board of the Dallas Khan. Not only from my ethical standpoint, being a former educator, still a licensed teacher, I do not believe ever in taking advantage of anybody. So all I could think was, oh my God, like she's taking advantage of kids in this school, which I later learned, I have not verified this because I'm terrified to search anything that has to do with her. You'll learn all the computers I went through. That the Dallas Khan evidently, and I say supposedly because I have not verified this, lost some of their federal funds because of some of the activities that Cheryl was doing. That is not verified by Parris Rigby. That was told to me by a very reliable source, but I cannot say that's actually true, but I'm just letting you know. So at that time in 2013, I went to Primo's and I met Ira Terrell and Malcolm Wentworth, and I said, Malcolm, and I also was I was about 2 years into what I have now cloned the shit show of the century, the modern day Bonnie and Clyde. Excuse my language. However, at that time, I was, as I stated, drowning. So I was trying to keep my head above water, but I was also, my heart, my soul, the way I was raised is you don't let somebody get taken advantage of if you know what's going on and you see it with your own eyes. And obviously, because I had taught myself computer languages, I was paying attention to domains, I paid attention to URLs, I paid attention to things that the average soul would not when they typed in Dallas Khan. So I'm sure that day that I met with them, I do not hold any fault in either one of them. Ira has been a good friend for years. I haven't seen him, I haven't seen a lot of people in many years, but I didn't know Malcolm Wentworth. But I think they were completely overwhelmed. But one thing Malcolm Wentworth did say to me was, he goes, this might explain why many people in the office at the Dallas Khan Academy that worked at the Dallas Khan Academy were having their identities stolen and their credit cards siphoned. Of course, I just sat back like this. I didn't say anything because I have no proof that she was doing it. All I could say to him was what was happening, what I was seeing with my own eyes. Because at that point, as you will learn later on, when we go through all the events and exactly how each single event she sabotaged. I've told you a little bit earlier, but she sabotaged. And had money going through PayPal accounts that I knew nothing about, links turning to Chinese through a security company, which you'll learn about, and things like that. However, I think by the time we ended that lunch that day, I know Ira's head was spinning, and Ira knows me, and he knows that, he knows that I'm not somebody that's going to just throw stuff out there, and I have a hard time ever saying, just because somebody's done me wrong, I'm not a revengeful person. This was me trying to take care of people. Because Cheryl also worked for somebody that is very famous, and I met him. He lived in the building that I lived in at one point. I reached out to him at some point and also explained to him what was happening within myself, Dallas Khan, yada, yada. That ended up backfiring on me, which is okay. I don't hold him accountable because he put her in charge of all of his marketing, all of his, I don't even know what. But I will say this, that I have never stepped foot in his venue or his car shop in my entire life. We know each other because we lived in the same building. We know each other because of Cheryl Reyes and a crawfish bowl. But he ended up, I think this is what I tell myself, at that time, it was too much for him to take in because she was running so much of his company. Or marketing and stuff. Well, evidently they ended up having a situation, and I was logged in on my Facebooks at his business. I've never set foot in his business, never done any of that. So let's get back to the event sabotage. The event sabotage, as I will go into detail in a later podcast, exactly down to the penny of how it happened. It wasn't just that money, see, so evidently when you buy a ticket through Eventbrite, which we never set up an Eventbrite. I built the website, it was a PayPal link, and that was it. But that now makes sense to me, and you will learn after I tell you about an event that we did in which there was over $1,000 worth of money that was being put into a what I call emulated, spoofed, whatever, copied event of mine, or event ticket. So guests would go to that thinking they were buying a ticket to my place because it was all emulated, but it really went to somebody else. I cannot say that went to her, but I can say that I found multiple times why the charges were different. Because sometimes people would call me and say, Parris, why is it that Susie Q, like, she bought 2 tickets and it's $40? Why is it that I bought 2 tickets and it's $44.59? And I'm just saying $44.59. I don't know the exact amount. And at the time, I was like, I don't know. So I remember one day I asked Cheryl, and guess what? I have that document somewhere. Oh, it's right here. This is a perfect example of a ticket sale that was done through what Cheryl set up that was outside the realm of the one PayPal link that all the rest of the hosts and hostesses used. She used this situation as doing registration, so when people would come people were confused all of a sudden. Years, it's been consistency. Allison Ainsworth ran the front door, the same hosts and hostesses. People were familiar. The same ticket prices, the same everything. Then all of a sudden, it's like, whoa, I can't pay for my ticket in advance. I'm having to register for my ticket. And what am I registering for? Or then after I caught on to that, it changed. It changed to, I didn't know that you were using Eventbrite, or you're using a different source, even one of a company that Cheryl, I believe it was Cheryl that set it up, that was all about events and things. We'll go into that in a little bit. But anyway, so people were confused. Guests were confused. People knew that these parties, these events were, and I'm not exaggerating. You can ask Larry Bankston, Mark Michaels, they're both Dallas police officers. You can ask anybody that worked any of my parties. There were over 1,000 people at every event that we did. So people felt more secure by coming when they knew that they had paid for their ticket in advance. Just like they felt really good and secure about standing in that line, knowing that Allison Ainsworth was standing at the front door, and she was the one that was greeting everybody. And I mean, I don't know how she did it. I tried to help her one time and I couldn't. I was like, it's too much for me. But regardless, the demise changed the way it happened. And I'm just going to use the last name. This particular individual, Ellis, they'd been going to my events for a long time, just like Scott knew me for a long time too. They were confused by the event registration, and they were also confused by the dollar amount, that a friend had paid $20 per ticket or $40 for 2 tickets, and that all of a sudden they were paying $22 and $44 and something cents. That was all Cheryl Reyes was doing. So when I would ask her, sometimes I would have to ask multiple times, and sometimes I'd have to get really stern, and I'm not an attorney. Hopefully one day I'll go to law school. But I had to get very direct, as if somebody was on the witness stand. And that would be the moment where she would crumble. And she would send me the email, the threads of emails and things like that, that she wouldn't realize that she was actually sending me, that I would later learn was a part of part of over 100 exhibits for a federal lawsuit against Cheryl Rios in 2013. Another example of the way that Cheryl sabotaged, and I say sabotaged, I would say attempted to sabotage, but I've never been screamed at so much in my entire life and had people thinking that I was the one dropping the ball. And you will learn in a later podcast, because I will go event by event, exactly what she did and how she did it, or how I believe, or what evidence shows that she did. But in 2013, I was doing a Cinco de Mayo party at Coup d'etat, which is a place here in Dallas. One of the owners was Patrick Tetrick. I didn't know him from Adam. He evidently knew me from my second family. Who knows? Dallas is a small town. Cheryl and I had kind of stopped doing business together because I was bringing all the business. Of course, she blamed that on me, and she was very, very good at being a master manipulator. Blaming it on me, making it seem like it's my fault, and this and that, which I believe that all of her manipulation was premeditated. Looking back, learning about the different mental situations that I was put in, I believe it was premeditated for sure. But that's just my opinion. Regardless, that particular night on Cinco de Mayo, which we did a Cinco de Mayo party, I say we, our group of people, like we had the same host and hostess pretty much for the duration of the 10 years. We had it at Coup d'etat. And all of a sudden, all of these people started coming that had not bought a ticket in advance. And as I think it was Domingo, the officer of the century, that said this to me, that said, you have to look for patterns in criminals, whether that be their behavior or whatever you're seeing on the web. And people started coming to the door and they hadn't bought a ticket. What they were saying was that they had gone on meetup.com. I, Parris Rigby, at that point had never heard of meetup.com in my entire life. I didn't know what that was. It was foreign to me. I then went to that site and found the invitation and found where Cheryl was actually having correspondence with the individuals about the event that she was clearly sabotaging. So, the ways in which the sabotage occurred, I will go into much greater detail per event. There's a whole set of binders over there of every event and the way it happened. It was financially, it was integrity, reputation, it was everything. But I'm going to wrap up the events with that, the meetup.com. But I will say this. She used the name Alexa, which was the same alias name that she used when she logged into my Verizon Wireless. And all of a sudden, my accountant calls me and goes, Parris, did you leave the country? And I said, what do you mean? I was like, my accountant at the time was my dad, because none of us could keep track with everything that was happening and how fast it was happening. And my dad has a very witty personality. And so I just kind of laughed and I was like, what do you mean? I go, I haven't even taken my computer out of my home. And he said, well, your bills all of a sudden doubled and tripled. And that was because, as I mentioned earlier, I believe in an earlier podcast, if not, I'll tell you now, Cheryl had illegally gained access to my Verizon Wireless, my private Verizon Wireless. And she used the name Alexis and a completely different phone number to actually send and receive messages and to use as her correspondence. When I called Verizon Wireless that particular day, because at this time I was like, I was just dealing with everything. I wasn't in just trauma mode. I was just dealing. And the Verizon Wireless representative, which I have all the notes, said you need to go to kgbpeople.com. K is in kangaroo, G is in girl, B is in boy, people.com. And type that number in. The phone number that was used as the alias name Alexis, and I did. And guess whose profile showed up? It was Cheryl Reyes. I'm sure she'll have a really good, really good premeditated excuse as to how that happened. Because she does typically try to make it look like somebody else, the innocent individual, has done something wrong. Because I have found throughout my records things I'm going, whoa, I didn't do that. But again, I was naive enough to go into business with her and allow her over to my house. As I stated in an earlier podcast, I know that a day that I feel very certain the day that she completely got into my computer, which was the day of a crawfish bowl we were going to. That was in May of 2013. So anyway, you will learn throughout this podcast, throughout whether it's this one or the future episodes, she used so many aliases. It would be compared to you and I using toilet paper during COVID. It was crazy. I've never seen anything like it. Middle initials, different last names. And I just recently realized, because she's blocked on my Facebook, because I really don't want anything to do with her. And she changed her last name back to one of those alias ones. Namaste, good for you. But I just want to bring that up. We will talk more about event sabotage later on. The next thing I want to talk about is you probably may or may not have ever heard of illegal backlinking, which means that if you're a business owner or you're somebody selling a product, maybe it's like a side job, you're trying to make ends meet. We are in 2023 and inflation is pretty high right now. Eggs have gone up 70%. Therefore, backlinking is actually illegal. I had never heard of this before in my entire life. But at the time, I was very close friends with somebody. And I'll just use his first name. His first name was Josh. And he was number 1 or number 2 at that time in the world for SEO, which is search engine optimization. He's the one that told me, which we'll get later into, about step away from your computer because your entire email's just wiped out. And I was like, oh, no way. I'm still looking at him. Oh, he was right. He's the one that told me, he goes, Parris, because I was explaining to him about our events, and he said to me, he said, Parris, there are multiple websites that are, and I say illegally backlinked, because he asked me, he goes, did you give permission to have these websites backlinked? Meaning that when traffic went to my website, which, my toprung.org, then it would immediately send out feelers or it would immediately, depending on how they had it set up, the listeners, what's called a listener, how they had it set up in the JavaScript to send traffic to their site. And there were hundreds. And I said, of course, at the time I was really, I only knew HTML, JavaScript, CSS style sheets, XHTML. I was like, I didn't know what he was talking about. So I said, what do you mean? And he goes, there are hundreds of websites that are illegally backlinked on yours. And guess what? Not only every company at that time that Cheryl Reyes owned was illegally backlinked, multitudes of my friends, and I'm not going to use last names, but I'll use first names, Bree, other people that had either event companies, PR companies, Michelle, and companies I've never even heard of. Companies also that I later realized were clients of Cheryl Reyes's, and I guess she gained her money by giving them the impression they were having more traffic. But they weren't getting more traffic for organic reasons, like meta tags, title tags, headers or footers. They were gaining more traffic because every single site that she had access to or that I looked at, she was illegally backlinking. I confronted her about this, and at this point I was about to drown. So I didn't use the normal tactic that I would, which would be like to sit back and watch. I was like, what in the hell's going on? Because people expected these charity events, not only from the person who the money went to, the net proceeds, but also from the group of people that we all got together. And everybody has things going on in their lives. And everybody looked forward to the community that we built together. And that was their one safe place. And I was the one that was like, the bull, the one that carried the whole thing. And I'm trying to keep my life above board and explain to people. And then also you will learn about 60 other victims. Most of them were hosts and hostesses to my parties that became victims of the situation. Regardless, at that time, Cheryl Reyes was illegally backlinking hundreds of websites. I had confronted her, and I'll just use his first name, Denise. She's also another victim. She's another one that owned her own business. And she had spoofing. She had a job her domain for her business, which I'm not going to say. It's not the same business she has now, but her domain that she had for her business was sending out spam. The same thing that happened with 6 other people, and we all had our computers analyzed, and I've got all the reports. At that time, Denise took me to Office Depot because I was just like, I was printing stuff off I couldn't even probably today afford to be able to print off stuff like that I was doing at that time because inflation. Copies then were like 5 cents. Now I don't know what they are. They're probably a lot more. But I was printing stuff off, and I confronted Cheryl, and guess what? The tactic changed. She stopped illegally backlinking on the toprung.org, and she went to another different situation how she's doing things, and then she went back to it and then added other domains to it. There were 3 different times that we checked for it. And every time Josh would say to me, Parris, he was like number 1 and number 2 in the world for SEO. He was blown away. And another thing that you will learn is that many times when somebody would come to my rescue would try and help me or listen to me crying because I was completely overwhelmed, there would be some form of retaliation that would happen towards them. For example, Allison Ainsworth had what we would call a check fraud scheme pinned on her, which was fraudulent and bogus. Josh had a situation in which there was a surgeon in Dallas that he was actually at an attorney's law practice working with that attorney on building his website on this particular day. But he almost got in trouble. if he didn't know what he was talking about, because their entire database was wiped out that particular day. And they traced the domain, or I'm sorry, not the domain, the IP and the geo-tracking to Josh's home. Thank God, whatever religion you believe in, that Josh had an alibi and he was a very credible individual. He was so upset about that. I will never forget him sitting there in my living room, and he had just worked so hard to build his SEO company and worked so hard because his mother, he built his SEO company and taught himself all this because his mother had something, there was something, like, has a health issue, and he decided that his mom opened her own business, and he's like, I'm going to help you, I'm going to get you on the web, I'm going to get you like organic rankings, and he's a good guy. And let me tell you, his world almost blew up for the second time because of Cheryl. So I have many, I mean, Denise and I were shocked when we would go to Office Depot and print off, or Denise at the time, a part of her business, she had a commercial printer, and she would print stuff off for me until her Yahoo account got hacked. Her Yahoo account got hacked within minutes of me sending some form of evidence that I was collecting, whether it was a screenshot or whatever was going on, because I was just collecting a lot of evidence, and I didn't even know what all this meant at the time because it was happening so fast. And it was an account that she never used, but it got hacked. And then it started freaking Denise out, because then all of a sudden she couldn't do her business because her domain was sending out like Java and sending out like bad. It got blocked on Google. The same thing that happened to Gary. The same thing that happened to me. The same thing that happened to Denise, and there are a few others. Then all of a sudden, now the backup email address that she used, that I'd known Denise for probably 15 years, maybe 10, 12 years at that point, and I didn't even know she just never used it. And the IP address, it matched all the hundreds of IP addresses that I have on Cheryl Reyes and her minions. Therefore, Denise and I were then running around, and I wasn't taking my car because I was being followed a lot. So Denise and I were running around, going to Office Depot, picking up these pages and pages of backlinks. And a lot of times I would just scan it real fast and just determine like who's, is there something on here that I know or not? And sometimes if I, just could take a deep breath, I would call the person, like I called Bree and told her about hers. But I didn't really have enough knowledge to explain. And obviously, when I'm talking to somebody and they know nothing about what I'm saying, and my heart's pounding like crazy because I'm just going, I felt like the need to like help these people because they had no idea that their business was being sabotaged. You will learn, and just because you put up a website, it all sounds great, but you always need to know the security aspects of it. And backlinking, illegal backlinking, because it's illegal to do unless you get permission, is one of those things. As I reviewed the PayPal that we used over the years, because I had multiple accounts because I had to. As you will learn, I had multiple Uverse accounts with AT&T, multiple Verizon accounts. I had every account I owned, Dropbox, everything, because they were all hacked and they were all being siphoned and emulated. I mean, it was the biggest mess. But at that particular time, PayPal. Cheryl Reyes had access to the PayPal because I always believed that I didn't want to be the only person looking at it. Allison Ainsworth had access to it too. There were other people, so that we kept credibility with everybody. I learned later that Cheryl and suspect number 2 were transferring money to their own personal accounts and suspect number 2 to their mother's account. And I'm sure they'll come up with a really good excuse because, a master manipulator is just that. However, Cheryl, in my opinion, was more diabolical. Her transfers were in less amounts than suspect number 2. I actually, at the time, was drowning, and maybe I wrote a note about it because there's tons of notes that I took, but I realized recently just the amount, and it seems like I was paying one of her bills monthly because there was the same like $180 something that came out monthly, and I say $180, I'm saying off the top of my head, that came out monthly for a couple months in a row, and I'm like, what? I mean, I don't even know what that was for, because she had multiple PayPal accounts. And even if we were business together, she should have told me that she set up a PayPal account under that business. So there was that. Then there are the mystery email addresses. We all get spammed emails. I don't really check email very often because I'm kind of at this point a little allergic to it. After I set up, I don't know, 20 or 30 email addresses over that decade, trying to keep Cheryl and her minions out of my stuff. But I will say one thing. Part of those setting up those email addresses, I would use them sometimes for a day, sometimes for a week, sometimes for a month, sometimes for a year. But one place that Cheryl was not very smart were the alias names that she used. Because as we go back to PayPal for a second, she did a whole scheme behind the scenes in one of the email addresses that I set up and I used for maybe 2 weeks. Boy, it didn't take her long to get in there. And she used an alias name, Mia Walters. That name was actually part of one of the schemes that was used within my PayPal account to illegally siphon money. With that being said, I'll briefly touch on it. There were fake invoices that were set up in PayPal. Some of them were actually invoices that were set up that actually were people that I know that were hosts. But I happen to know that those particular people, and I can tell you straight up, I would go to court and say there's no way that they would have taken, no. But Mia Walters was one of those. So when I, of course, was doing, because I was used to my Facebook, having all these AT&T phone numbers going through it and all this, Skype and all this other stuff going through it, I was kind of, getting kind of used to what I was looking for. And I was writing code, so I, right-click, inspect element, and you can see it all. So that was another alias that she used. Cheryl did not hold back on gender when it came to her aliases. She used alias emails, she used alias names, and as the years progressed, until 2016, after 2016, by 2017, I quit collecting evidence. I was very, very ill with arsenic poisoning, and I just said, I can't do this. But up until that point, I was finding email addresses under the company that we set up. I was finding them under, the famous actress's cousin. It was nuts. I couldn't believe the amount that she was doing. And I'll just tell you one thing. If you're going to set up a fake email address, which I think is ridiculous, it's like setting up a fake profile. One thing you can always do is you can right-click and go to Inspect Element and read the message header. You don't have to necessarily know how to read and write HTML or XHTML, but there's always those IP addresses. And when somebody's trying to hide or spoof an IP address, there's usually a bracket before it, which gives you their real identity. And that is the way I was able to tie Cheryl Reyes to many, 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 many of these situations and these alias emails. Sometimes she would send her own signature on the email. Other times it wouldn't have anything. But it was those IP addresses. And boy, does Parris Rigby have a photographic memory for IP addresses and numbers. But even if you don't, all you have to do is take a piece of paper. And this is something that everybody needs to know. If you get an email and you think it's from your boss and he's telling you to transfer money, and you're like, oh, I usually do this for my boss all the time, it's no big deal. You need to stop and learn how to read the message header behind an email. And you need to verify that that email is really your boss's email and it's not a spoofed one. You need to know how to go to open source, which is a website where you can do a trace route. And you can go, wait a second, I may not have a photographic memory for numbers, but oh, by the way, I can actually look at this and go, my boss, I pay all of his bills. He doesn't use AT&T or he doesn't use Verizon, and this one belongs to Verizon. That's something that I believe everybody needs to know, because I've heard so many stories about money being transferred. But in my case, I tied this entire room of evidence together through those IP addresses. In 2013, during that 6-month period when Cheryl and I were business partners, whatever that is her definition of, and she would deny this, but I had a very smart individual bring something up. I was on Skype with her. This was pre-Zoom Skype. And I knew there was a bunch of stuff running through the back end of my Facebook, but I didn't realize it was Skype. And listening, it's called Listener and, events and whatever. Cheryl Reyes, I didn't know at the time that she had a landline. And I later learned she had multiple. And I was on Skype with her, and I was working from my house, and she was working from her house, and we were supposedly working on the business we were doing together. But I'm the only one that brought the clients to the table. She kept all hers herself. And all of a sudden, a phone rings, and she answers it. And I hear her say, quote, unquote, "Did you get the database? Did you get the database?" And I'm on the other end of the Skype going, okay, number one, who is she talking to? Because I didn't even know she had another number, much as a landline or another cell phone. I was just like, what? And she would probably deny this. However, that particular hard drive was copied by a cybersecurity person. And it is of my understanding that it is probably still in his safety deposit box, because that's where he said he put it. I don't know. But I had somebody very smart and wise say to me when I mentioned this to them recently, that could probably be pulled up from the hard drive, because it wasn't long after that situation that I was on to my next computer. She quickly realized that I heard what she was saying, and I got chills even saying this to you. She completely just stopped the Skype. And in my mind, I was like, what is going on? Like, I mean, at that point, I was going by the fact that she worked for the Dallas Can, and, you know, she was a godly person. I had no idea what I was in tune for. And I'm sure that's one of those things that she'll come up with a really good excuse, a really good whatever. Put me on a lie detector test, and I'll tell you the same thing. And I can guarantee you I will win. Because that was, to me, at that time, in 2013, we as the world had just heard about, or maybe it was my own naivety ears, because, you know, I didn't really know databases or anything like that. And we had just learned about Neiman Marcus being what I thought was one of the first major database breaches. I'm not saying Cheryl Reyes had anything to do with that, but I'm saying because I read the paper at that time every single day and I watched the news, I was very in tune to what was going on in the world, in our city, and everything. And so I knew about the Neiman Marcus breach. I mean, other than the fact that I was a victim of it, and a victim of it from the standpoint of I didn't have an account with Neiman's, but yet I got a letter in the mail saying that I did have an account. Looking back, I'm sure it was one of my identity thefts, but I just went, who knows, whatever. It didn't mean much to me other than I paid attention to what was going on in the world. So when she said database, I thought, because my database, Parris Rigby's, that I created when I was doing all of my events, I did that organically. I've said in previous podcasts, I didn't know what anybody did for a living. I didn't care. You know, I cared about, were you a good person? Were you going to be safe? You know, were you going to cause a problem at our event? That's what I cared about. You know, I got to know a lot of new people. But I've never brought this up except to one person about the database that she evidently got a call on her landline from. That person was very wise, and this is only the second time I've ever said this. So at that time, I just filed it in my brain as a semi-unimportant, meaning semi because the word database to me, I was like, wait a second, we just heard about Neiman's, and then we would later learn about Wells Fargo and all the other ones that happened. But I just thought, okay, whatever. I didn't really understand what a database was because, you know, I evidently had my own that I collected organically, but I didn't even realize that was what it was. I was just collecting email addresses for people that attended my events, and then I'd make sure that they got an invitation to the next event because people would ask me because we did throw some amazing events. You paid $20 and you got the time of your life. I mean, it was amazing for everybody. It wasn't like you paid $20, you stood in line and you didn't get entertainment or anything like that. I mean, you can ask anybody that attended our events, any of our officers, anybody, because they all worked for the duration of the 10 years that we did that. So with that being said, that is a database. I would love for somebody in law enforcement to get that hard drive and do a search on it. Because the wise person that told me that that's probably still there, because, hey, at that point I was going through computers and Google Chromebooks and cell phones pretty rapidly. I believe this person was right. It's probably still there. But I can't wait to hear the excuse that Cheryl Reyes would come up with. Maybe at this point, and all the people that she's done wrong, she may be running out of them. But, you know, who knows? I mentioned earlier about adding to the company that we formed together. The biggest mistake I've ever made in my entire life We had that company for about 6 months, and during that time, like 6 months, I told you I brought all the clients to the table, and we hadn't done anything with it since 2013. In fact, I sent in paperwork to have the company shut down, and evidently that didn't get to the Secretary of State because, as you will later learn, the mail fraud was out of control. And yes, there's one particular address that I can tie it all to, but we'll get back to that. 2018 or 2019, I did mention to you earlier that there was something on the paperwork for adding to that changed. It was the claims agent. And I thought to myself, this is very interesting. Nobody, to my knowledge, has used this business in years. Barely did anything anyway, because I was the only one bringing in the business and I was drowning at the same time. But Cheryl Reyes' niece all of a sudden became the claims agent on the LLC with the Secretary of State. Now, you will learn as this podcast goes on, and I just got chills telling you this, the level in which everything that had my name on it, from the Secretary of State to Frost Bank to Chase Bank to everything, including things that you would think were 100% liable, and they probably were, but they didn't have the security features to keep up with Cheryl Reyes. The fact that her niece became a claims agent in 2018 and 2019, I have never told a soul this until just now. I mentioned it earlier, but I didn't use the names, but that's what happened. And also, I was told over the years to do background checks with the Secretary of State, the state of Texas, because of all the identity theft and everything that I went through. There were actually a couple of years in which I gave my little fingerprints, because I have little hands, that I went and gave those fingerprints, and I've never told a soul this, ever, that I would get my background report back from the Secretary of State, the state of Texas, and it would be 2. They would come in on different days, and the platform or the format in which the background check came was completely different. I have that, and I've never told anybody. I've chalked that up with the fact that my previous car, I couldn't get the state inspection sticker done with the state of Texas because they would either look at me as having no VIN number or having 2 VIN numbers. Nobody could figure it out. I'm not blaming the Secretary of State, their website, or the state of Texas on any of this. I'm just telling you what happened. As I mentioned earlier about a phone number, and I said that there was, I actually, for some reason in my gut that particular day, I did a trace route on this phone number. And I went and searched it through all the social media accounts that I could, because that particular phone number, it was coming up as my mom's name, different phone number, but it said that she was doing a FaceTime with me, and she was in the next room. My mother is smarter than that. So I said to her, did you just send me a FaceTime call from a different number? She was like, no, what are you talking about? And that's what made me do the searches. That's when I realized that there was a whole multitude of people that were working behind this particular phone number to cause these problems, and some of the other things that I can trace back to Cheryl Reyes that were of what I would call children. Children meaning you are 18 years old, 16 to 18 years old, or a little bit older. Just saying, I got the evidence. We will continue this episode on Cheryl Reyes and all the situations that occurred on the next episode. But I want to say thank you to the men and women in blue and the men and women in our military, and for everybody that puts their life on the line every single day to make us safe and to keep us from the situations that occur in our country, which is an amazing one. And I want to say thank you to, Domingo Rivera. He always says, Parris, don't say this, but he does deserve the Officer of the Century Award. He is the man that has stood by me since a 911 call with 2 other victims since 2016. And he has given countless hours and time. I've cried to him. He's been there for me. And I would say thank you. I always like to say that for him and for every man, all the levels of law enforcement and the bureaus. We'll see you next week for the continuation of Cheryl Reyes. Buckle up and get your popcorn.